welcome to the Ophthalmology Business Podcast. We help you develop your ideal practice with the help of other doctors and experts. The topics we cover include marketing, management, leadership, recruitment, HR, mindset, and more. I'm Dr. Dave Lazar, one of the co-hosts of this podcast. Every listener of this podcast is welcome to join the Ophthalmology Business Academy at www.obacademy.org. Membership is on us, and it's our gift to you. Today, I am excited to talk to Dr. Jonathan Cabin, facial and reconstructive surgeon at Skin DC, chief medical officer, and member of the board of directors at Macro Trials. Today, he'll be talking about incorporating clinical trials into your ophthalmology practice. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us. I think that everyone listening is going to take away a lot of interesting pearls today. I thought that we could just start with a short introduction about your academic background, because you are a physician, but you're not really an ophthalmologist. Can you just walk everyone through your training, and then we'll take it from there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just first of all wanted to thank you for having me on the podcast. We've known each other for a little bit of time, and it's really nice to just connect with you in general, but also appreciate the opportunity to chat for others to hear us. So my background in a nutshell is I actually, interestingly, started out as an investment banker, believe it or not. I went to University of Pennsylvania, graduated with a degree in economics, went into traditional investment banking, and decided pretty early on that it wasn't for me and that I kind of wanted to do medicine. I would get the Wall Street Journal in the morning every day, and I would always skip to the sort of the biotech medical sections and read about new drugs and stuff. And it kind of told me that I was in the wrong field. So I went back to school, did my pre-medical work at Columbia University, ended up going to Yale Medical School for my MD, and then went and did a otolaryngology head and neck surgery residency in New York City at New York Eye and Ear, which is I know a lot of ophthalmologists know about it. It's got a very prestigious ophthalmology program, a pretty prestigious head and neck surgery program, but I think it's more well known for ophthalmology. It's now part of Mount Sinai. And then I went out to LA and did a fellowship in facial plastic and reconstructive surgery, where I ended up staying for several years, building a practice out in Beverly Hills, and also being involved in the formation and iterations of Macro Trials, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about today. And more recently moved back east to Virginia to join an amazing group here called Skin DC. I'm the facial plastic surgeon there. It's a cosmetic dermatology practice, and continue to be very involved with macro and sort of continuing to build my practice here.
Well, you have quite an unbelievable background. It's certainly something that I found interesting when we first met. Do you think, before we kind of get into the clinical trials aspect, which is really, the main focus of today, what advantage do you think having an MBA and having this business background, do you think it translated at all into your medical career?
I think it did, but I think it does in an indirect way. So I'm a believer that I think what you major in college, which for me was economics, kind of becomes the context or the framework within which you view the world. So I think I've always sort of viewed the world through the concepts and constructs of economics, supply and demand, equilibriums in the marketplace, and it extends beyond just strict economic sense, and it kind of gives you sort of a brain framework for thinking about things. And I think in a lot of ways, having that somewhat unique background and framework and then bringing it into medicine, it doesn't necessarily make you more financially savvy or business savvy, although there is an element of that, but it kind of gives you a different perspective as you're going through training and, being amongst people who, for the most part, and this isn't a bad thing, had a more standard sort of, biology or chemistry or sciences background in college. So I think in some ways the advantage is that I have sort of a unique perspective in medicine, but it's not necessarily like, oh my God, I'm so much better at running a business or, at the financial aspect.
Got it. That makes sense. So clinical trials and participating in clinical trials is a really important part of my practice. And that's initially how we met with macro trials. So tell me a little bit about your path on, you're in LA now, you're doing plastics. How did you come up with the idea, get involved with macro?
It's funny because, if I'm just being honest here, I don't have a really strong clinical research background. I never was super interested in doing a lot of research. Obviously, I checked the box for research at various points in my career to, make sure that I had that as part of my CV and, as a critical component of my training. But it's something that I'm not against clinical research. I think it's really important. Of course, I'm involved in an entity that does it at a very high level. But to me, it was never like doing the research, doing clinical research as a practitioner was never a passion of mine. But what ended up happening with macro is that when I joined my fellowship director, mentor in practice in Beverly Hills after training, we had discussed a bit about forming an entity that could essentially help us do our own research, help us bring in our own trials. And as a way to and we can talk a little bit more about the benefits of doing clinical research, and I can talk about that. I can talk about all the different ways it can help and the various sort of incentives that come along with it. But essentially, we were trying to build out a separate entity that would allow us to do research as sort of a business. And to make a long story short, at the similar time, there's a colleague of ours who was a big academician who had moved into private practice in Beverly Hills, who had been involved in the development early stages of a very big drug, and had left the university and was in private practice and had been interested in continuing to be involved with these very high level FDA sponsored clinical trials, but didn't have the infrastructure because he was no longer part of a big academic institution. And he and I had been talking about it, and we basically, I realized that there was an opportunity to take our sort of skeleton of a company that had a clinical research coordinator and some, other infrastructure and bring to bear in his practice to allow him to do this research without having to do the heavy lifting, but having to spend the money to invest in his own backbone and then without having to be part of academics. And, the hypothesis was proved correctly that we were able to do research at a very high level. We were able to outperform all the other sites in the country. And we're able to actually help bring to market a very, very high impact drug that also happens to have a very large profit margin. And so a lot of kind of sponsors and CROs and people in the industry were somewhat their eyebrows raised a bit, like, how are they doing this? And it sort of spawned into what now is been iterated into what we're doing now, which is helping people like you and other people in private practice do very high level research. Was that a long-winded answer? Or did that make sense?
So I kind of get it, but just to make sure that we're saying the same thing. So what macro really is in its essence is a outsourced clinical trials department that can be plugged and play for any type of practice, whether it's, I guess, was this do you want to tell me a little bit about the type of research this was?
Yeah. So it was for an oculoplastic surgeon. It was related to a drug for thyroid eye disease. And essentially it was a kind of, a lot of times with business, as most of you will know, it's about right place, right time, right idea. And we were in the right place at the right time with the right idea, which was essentially that, it doesn't require being part of an academic institution to do good FDA sponsored clinical research. It's a historical sort of, it's historical, and it's somewhat a remnant of the older way that things were done in the medical system, that a lot of research is done at academic institutions. But in fact, if you dig into the data a bit, you realize that it's done very inefficiently. And if you are able to put together a team, which we have, that can basically serve as a research arm of anybody in any practice as a plug and play, as you mentioned, you can actually not only do really good clinical research, you can outperform academic institutions and most importantly, do it in a way that's more fun and efficient than if you were sort of part of a bigger, sort of clunkier, more old-fashioned academic institution.
Right. So, in the retina community, the private practices have definitely been dominating clinical research, just like you're saying. I spent just under 2 years at a big retina group before I formed my own practice, and they had their own dedicated clinical research department. And it was a massive undertaking to build that, and they did a great job doing it. And so when I formed my own practice, I wanted to kind of replicate that. And what I was finding was difficult is that it takes a lot of manpower to have a dedicated staff
Yep.
and a clinical trials coordinator and people to interface with the CROs and try to get new trials. So when I met you and learned about macro and we did our first trial together, it was like a kind of a light bulb moment that it was so brilliant because it lowered the barrier to entry for me to participate in clinical trials. And I think I've done 4 or 5 clinical trials with the help of macro's execution. And it allows me to not hire anybody because I use all of macro's staff and my patients in my office. And it's like a perfect marriage. So I obviously think it's a fantastic idea. And that's why I'm so happy that you agreed to come on and talk about macro. So what would you recommend to an ophthalmologist out there in private practice? They're interested in getting involved in clinical trials, but they don't really know where to start. What would you say to that person?
Yeah, it's a great question. The quick and easy answer is contact macro because we'll help you. But let me say a few background things here. I think part of the issue that exists in the clinical trial world and that we're trying to solve, what the biggest pain point is that there's an unfair advantage, or there has been an unfair advantage if you want to do clinical research, that if you want to do it, it's sort of, you have to be part of an academic institution. And it's for a number of reasons, and I won't get into it, but it has to do with the sort of the historical nature of clinical research, who gets the trials, and, importantly in this case, the ability to do them, the infrastructure to do them, the infrastructure to win trials, the infrastructure to perform trials, the connections with the sponsors. And so I will say that part of the reason macro exists is because if you are an independent practitioner, whether you're in ophthalmology or retina or in any specialty, it's very, very difficult to do this on your own. And the reason it's very difficult to do on your own is because it requires a large infrastructure, and a large infrastructure requires not only the resources of your time, but also money. And so before you can even start performing trials, there's a huge upfront investment in terms of what you would need in place in order to win a trial. And so that's kind of why in academics, there's an unfair advantage, because you have that infrastructure built in. But the fact of the matter is that I personally believe that some of the best researchers out there are people that are not in academics, because they have the patient populations, they have the desire and the drive. Frankly, the research world needs more investigators, and they're not able to get them because a lot of the people that want to do these trials don't have the infrastructure. So let's say you're a private practitioner, you're in retina, and you want to do trials. Part of the struggle you're going to have is not having the infrastructure, not knowing how to contact the sponsors and CROs. You may be lucky, you may have a big practice, you may have a big name, and you'll have people approaching you to do trials. And we have a lot of investigators like this. But then they're going to say, well, in order to do a trial, you need a clinical research coordinator, you need to figure out the budget, you need to have this equipment, you need to have that, you need to have regulatory, and it becomes completely overwhelming. And so, my best advice is think about why you want to do research. Think about what kind of research you want to do. What indications do you want to focus on? What interests you for whatever reason? And then, come to I would like to say to us, but to a company like us, I don't think there's many out there, if at all. And tell us, say, hey, this is what I want to do. This is why I want to do it. And this is what I'm interested in. And let us help you plug that infrastructure in to do the trials. Let us help you connect with the sponsors and CROs we have relationships with. Let us help promote you. And, you can continue being a doctor and performing the clinical work and doing all the fun clinical stuff on the trial. And we take care of all the things that, you would think or would be overwhelming or would be headaches. And it's kind of a win-win.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's exactly how my experience with macro has been. So I'm glad that you said it so eloquently.
I hope it was eloquent. Let me say one more thing, and you can edit it out.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things with research that I just like to speak to is that I think there is sort of this, and I almost call it PTSD, to be honest. And I'll speak for myself here, but I've spoken to many other doctors that feel the same way, where if you are not that MD, PhD, or you're not that doctor that was super passionate about research, I left my medical training with a bad taste in my mouth around research, because I feel like a lot of, when you're trying to do research in training, or even when you're just starting out, there's so many hurdles. It's so inefficient. It's so, it doesn't, the IRBs and the regulatory and stuff, it feels like you're trying to do something and the whole world's stacked against you. And what I like to tell people is, think before you get into the ideas of what research is, because we have all these preconceived notions from our experience. Essentially, there's a number of reasons why you'd want to do it. And if you remove all the stresses and headaches around the regulatory and the IRBs and all the other stuff that we had to deal with, and you think about all the reasons you'd want to do research, right? There's so many reasons. One of the most obvious reasons is it's a great way to make passive income. You can do a relatively minimal amount of work, and it's important work, but it's the clinical side of the assessments and sort of the data collection, and make fairly good money depending on what trial you're involved in. But maybe money isn't your biggest incentive. Maybe it's you have a newer practice and you're trying to build a certain patient population. Well, if you're in a retina practice and you want to deal with macular degeneration and you want to build those patients, you could potentially be an investigator for those trials, and the trials help bring in patients who have macular degeneration, and then you end up building that patient population as a side effect of the trial. Or maybe you just want to build your CV or want to have more notoriety in a certain field. Once again, you could be involved in trials for that reason. So there's so many incentives to us depending on who we are and where we're at in our career and what motivates us to do research. And I think the most important point here is that it doesn't have to be hard. It doesn't have to be this onerous, crazy, burdensome thing with regulatory and all that stuff. Part of the beauty of what we do is that we allow you to do research for the reasons you want to, without all the inefficiencies and headaches around having to have your own setup and deal with all the other stuff.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cadden, for joining us today and talking to us about the role of clinical trials in ophthalmology. We appreciate it very much. I also want to take a moment to thank our listeners. We appreciate each and every one of you. We cannot do what we do without you. If you like our podcast, simply share it with your friends on social media. Also, please don't forget to write a review on iTunes or Google Play. Your reviews will help other doctors and practice owners find us. Till we meet again, wishing you all an amazing week ahead.